Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of our exciting video series with the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. My name is John Lustrea, and I'm joined by one of our incredible volunteers at the museum, Brad Stone. Thanks for being with us today, Brad.
Oh, gee, John, it's my pleasure as always.
It's a thrill to have Brad. You might recognize him from other such critically acclaimed videos on that we've put out, like Animals in the Civil War, the Jewish Experience in the Civil War, and more. So Brad's a repeat offender here on some of our videos. And today he's going to be talking to us about African Americans in the U.S. Navy. So that should be an excellent topic. I know I'm looking forward to it. Before we begin, just as always, want to say thank you for watching, number one. We couldn't really do anything we do without anyone watching us. We'd just be speaking into the void. So it's great to have you with us today, and we really appreciate that. If you like this video or you've liked any of the other videos that the National Museum of Civil War Medicine has put out, consider hitting the like button on this video. Hit like and share. That's the best way for free to support the museum. It helps us a great deal. Or if you haven't, you can like our page on Facebook. That way you can stay up to date with the latest happenings at the museum. Or if you have a YouTube account, you can subscribe to us on YouTube. All of that helps us out. And that's all free that anyone can do. If you want to take it up a notch and kind of contribute to us financially, the best way to do that is by becoming a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. We'll make sure there's a link to that in the comments. It's civilwarmed.org/support. Memberships, cheapest level is $25 a year. That's only about $2 and some change per month, which is, I think, a pretty good deal. Not only does it support the museum and videos like this, gets you free admission to the museum when we're open. We are open by appointment. You can reserve a time online. And if you're a member, you get free admission as well as 10% off in the gift shop. Sometimes more if you go up on the higher levels. So anyway, you get something out of it, we get something out of it, everybody wins. So if you want to support us in that way, becoming a member helps us out a great deal.
I'm a member. It's one of the best investments I've ever made.
Well, shucks, Brad, we appreciate you saying that. And we didn't pay him to say that either.
Right.
So with all that said, we'll go ahead and get into it. Brad has prepared some slides for us here. Let me pull these up. And there we have it. So as you can see, we're going to be talking about African Americans in the U.S. Navy, and especially the U.S. Africa Squadron and African American sailors during the Civil War. So this promises to be a good one. So go ahead and get us started here, Brad.
Okay, John. Well, thanks a lot. Yeah, I'm kind of bringing attention to an often overlooked aspect of the Civil War. The good news is that in recent years, there's been more and more attention paid to the role that African Americans played in the Union Army, thanks to films like Glory and other celebrations of those contributions. But unfortunately, I would argue, indispensable role that African Americans played in the Union Navy is still pretty much overlooked. And the other thing that's very often overlooked is the role that the U.S. Navy played even before the Civil War in trying to stem the international slave trade. And so I'd like to talk about both of those topics today and shed a little bit more light on them. So we could go to the next slide.
Yes. There we go.
To be more specific about it, the first thing I'd like to talk about in dealing with ways that the U.S. Navy and the African American participation in the Union Navy fundamentally changed America is what was known as the U.S. Africa Squadron, which operated before the Civil War to free enslaved people. And that's one of the first efforts by the United States government to do it, albeit it's a very limited one, but it is the first official step they take to start freeing people. So I think it's an important one to note. And the other one, as I mentioned before, is I want to focus attention on what African Americans will do during the Civil War within the US Navy or the Union Navy, and how that is going to impact sort of the status of African Americans in larger American society. So we can go on to the next slide. Pardon me. So to talk about the US Africa Squadron, it is basically a squadron of Navy ships that are designed to enforce American laws that prohibit American ships from dealing in the slave trade from Africa. And this law was passed in 1808. And it's something that is rather unique at that time in antebellum America. Now, what it does do is it prohibits American ships from transporting people against their will from Africa to anywhere in the world, not just the United States. But it's important to note that what it doesn't do is it doesn't do anything that affects the institution of slavery within the United States. So you can still buy and sell people, transport them across state lines, that sort of thing. But again, it's one of the first anti-slavery actions taken by the United States. So the Africa Squadron, as it's known, US Africa Squadron, is designed to cruise off the coast of West Africa to interdict ships dealing in the slave trade. And the US is obligated to have these squadrons by a series of treaties with Britain and other countries to help augment their efforts to do the same thing. The British Navy in particular had a very effective squadron off the coast of West Africa, and they're interdicting a lot of slave ships. But the problem is that early on, the US Africa squadrons that the United States sent over to West Africa were pretty puny and pretty ineffective. And this is a source of aggravation, particularly to the British, because one of the problems they have is that by the terms of the Treaty of 1812, they're not allowed to board American flag vessels. So basically, if you were a US ship dealing in the slave trade, you kind of had immunity against British ships if you were flying the US flag. So under increasing pressure, the United States finally agrees in the 1850s under the Buchanan administration to send a more robust Africa squadron, something that could really do the job, to the west coast of Africa. And so they go ahead and do that and really put teeth in our agreements to try to take action against the slave trade. So we can go to the next slide, please. So, you know, in 1859, a really revamped US Africa Squadron with the sloop of war Constellation as its flagship really starts to take effective action against slavers. Indeed, in the short amount of time they're there, from 1859 to 1861, they capture 14 slave ships. And fortunately, they're able to liberate 3,932 people that would have been going into slavery. And what they would do is they would send a prize crew, a small number of officers and men, aboard these slave ships that they had captured. They would sail the slave ships to Liberia, which was a free country on the west coast of Africa. And the people that were, had been enslaved aboard those ships were released in Liberia where they could be freed. There would be no danger that they would be re-enslaved. slave ship itself would then be sailed normally to New York, and the crew of that ship would undergo trial. And dealing in the slave trade at that time could be severely punished. You could be hanged for it. That was the theory. In practice, the courts were pretty corrupt in many cases, and many of the members of the slave crew just sort of disappeared. They never were tried. There was at least one instance, though, where a captain of a slave ship was hanged for his offenses. So in theory, it did have teeth. Very often in practice, it didn't, but in some occasions it did. The ship itself, the slave ship, would go under auction, and the proceeds from that sale would be distributed to the crew of the U.S. ship that had captured it. And that prize money could be substantial. It was divvied up among the crew. And for example, many sailors, when they received that prize money, got more money than they would get in their yearly salary. So, there was a system in place to try to deal with the slave trade. And again, in the period just before the Civil War, it's becoming more and more effective. Now, in terms of the sailors that, were dealing with these slave ships, it's important to note that, these guys were kind of rough, tough, they had seen it all, but even they were horrified with the conditions that they saw aboard these ships. And indeed, there's one sailor's account from the Constellation. They captured a slave ship called the Cora. And when he saw it, even he was appalled by it. And you see his description here. He wrote, it was a dreadful sight. The enslaved were all packed together like so many sheep, men, women, and children, entirely naked and suffering from hunger and thirst, having nothing to eat or drink for over 30 hours. Now, if he had gone into the details, it would have been far, far, more dreadful. The attrition rate or the mortality rate among the slaves on many of these ships, or enslaved people on board many of these ships, was phenomenally high. So again, although the U.S. effort to stem the slave trade was by no means perfect, at least this U.S. squadron made, notable advances in helping to free thousands of people that would have otherwise gone into slavery. So we can go with the next slide, please. So the USS Constellation itself, I'd just like to talk a little bit about that ship. It's the last living legacy of the U.S. Africa Squadron. It's also the last living legacy of the Union Navy. It's built in 1855 as the last all-sail major combatant ship that the Navy would build. It will see continuous action for over 100 years, which is remarkable. Something else that's noteworthy is when the Civil War starts, a lot of Navy ships are called back to the United States because they, need their service to deal with the Civil War. The Constellation is one of them, and on her way back, she intercepts a slave ship called the Triton, which is based in South Carolina. Well, South Carolina is now part of the Confederacy. And by capturing that ship, the USS Constellation scores the first Union naval victory in the Civil War. Now, she's still open to the public as part of the Historic Ships in Baltimore, another fine museum. I don't know if you've ever been there, John. Have you ever?
Well, yes, as an unpaid testimonial, my wife and I went there to visit Brad. Brad, he also volunteers aboard the USS Constellation. He's Mr. Volunteer. He's wonderful. So we went to go visit Brad there, and I can say it's a pretty remarkable sight, whether Brad's there or not. Brad definitely elevates the ceiling of how cool it is, but it's an incredible place to visit when you can go. Definitely would recommend it.
Oh, thanks, John. I appreciate that. And it will give you kind of an idea of what sailors during the Civil War experienced. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in this presentation. But the other thing to note about the Constellation is it does serve in the Civil War. It does a number of things for the Union Navy, but among its crew are 15 African-American sailors, including Jack Evans, who rises to the rank of petty officer coxswain. Now, the coxswain is one of the most important, figures on board the ship in terms of managing the day-to-day operations of a ship like the Constellation. Now, I mention them in part because it's worth mentioning, but also it helps me segue to the next portion of this presentation, which is the role that African Americans are going to play in the Union Navy. So it's important to note that African Americans are playing a significant role in the US Navy far before the Civil War. Unlike the US Army, which did not, by and large, permit African Americans to participate in any way in their operations, the Navy had permitted freed African Americans. These are the portion of African Americans in the United States who are what they would call free men. They are not slaves. They could participate in the Navy, and they did, and served with distinction, for example, in the War of 1812. Now, the participation of African Americans in the Navy continues to increase as more and more of these freed African Americans that seek to participate in the Navy, to the point where, because of the prevailing prejudices at the time, the Navy feels obligated in 1839 to actually put a cap, a ceiling, on the number of African American enlistments. They put it at 5%. That will dramatically change with the start of the Civil War, because at that point, the Navy has to rapidly expand, and they need all the skilled manpower they get or can get. Just to give you a sense of what's going on, the Union Navy starts out with about 44 ships. By the end of the war, they're going to have over 700. They become one of the largest navies in the world. And again, they need all the manpower they get. So that cap on freed African American sailors gets tossed out pretty quickly. Next slide, please. So now we come to the question about the vast majority of African Americans that are in the United States at the time of the Civil War, approximately 4 million enslaved African Americans. And what the interaction between those enslaved people or people escaping from enslavement will be with the Union forces. And before we get into that, I think we should talk a little bit about the term I have listed up on the title, contrabands, which is what those people were known as by and large. And John, would you like to talk a little bit about, what contrabands were?
Absolutely. There's a great video that we did recently with the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. We had Dr. Chandra Manning on, and she did an incredible job talking at greater length than I'm going to do here about contraband. So if this is interesting to you, I'd encourage you to go back and take a look at that video. But basically, so contraband of war is confiscated property that is benefiting an enemy. And so how that gets applied to people in this case, it's centered around a very specific event in 1861. Fort Monroe, which is a federal fort located in Virginia, which becomes part of the Confederacy. There are nearby Confederate forces, and they're having enslaved workers build trenches, do things, perform manual labor. And eventually these three individuals flee to Fort Monroe, hoping for sanctuary there. And Benjamin Butler, who's the general there, he is originally a lawyer. And so he's using his lawyer brain. The Confederate general in the area comes to Benjamin Butler and says, well, Fugitive Slave Act, you're required to return those, those runaways to me. But Benjamin Butler says, well, by your logic, you say that you are not under United States law anymore. And moreover, you claim that these people are property and these people are helping the Confederate war effort. So we seize them as contraband of war. And that has the effect of, going to the extent that something could go viral in the 19th century, it did. And that term spread far and wide, sort of using the logic, the pretty perverse logic, of course, but using the logic of the Confederacy that these people are property against them to, assist them in the short term. Now, as I talked about with Chandra Manning, this is an intense legal gray area for what this means, especially when the war is over. But in the short term, what these people do who now start to flee to Union lines in incredible numbers, to help their case for, that they should stick around and hopefully one day be counted as citizens, they work to make themselves useful to the federal government, to basically build a relationship with the federal government, say, in effect, we'll help you if you help us. And they're kind of banking on that. And one of the ways that this happens is with the U.S. Navy, as you're gonna talk about here, Brad. Does that pretty well sum it up?
Yeah, I think it does an excellent job of summing it up. And again, this term contraband becomes applied to the actual people themselves. So they're kind of known during this period as contrabands. So, the question becomes among the armed forces, what are they going to do concerning these contrabands? And the Navy, almost immediately determines what it's going to do. As early as July of 1861, the Navy across the board begins to augment its crews with these contrabands, helping the Navy deal with the manpower shortages they're facing. By contrast, during this period, there's kind of inconsistency in the Army. Some more progressive commanders like Butler does start to use this manpower. But other Union commanders don't. And there's even been some question about whether these people should be returned or not. And that doesn't really get sorted out for the Army until the Confiscation Act of August of 1861. But to turn back to the Navy for a second, and we'll go to the next slide, please. Yeah, very quickly on, the Navy has determined that, this manpower is not only useful, it is essential. So at first, contrabands are mainly used for sort of hard manual labor or servant-like tasks, but they very quickly impress naval commanders with not only their work ethic, but their skills as well. And as a result, pretty quickly, there is growing pressure among naval commanders to formally incorporate these, contrabands or African Americans who have escaped enslavement into their crews. Now, the Secretary of the Navy at the time, Gideon Welles, it has strong abolitionist leanings. So, based on these requests and his own feelings, he takes a fairly extraordinary step this early in the war on September 25th, 1861, announcing that the Navy will formally enlist these African American people as sailors. Now, albeit they have to enter the service at the lowest ranking of boys, which is lower than what you would the standard rank, which would be landsman. Now, part of this is done, again, because of the prevailing prejudice of the time, but I think there's also some sensitivity of what the reaction will be among white enlisted men. And as I'll talk about that later, that is a concern. But nonetheless, even though this is a low rank, and even though this means that initially most of these new African American sailors will still be performing the dirtiest and most physically taxing work, it does mean for the first time that they are getting a salary, and a substantial one at that, from their vantage point. So it's a definite advance. The other thing that's going on in the
And
Navy is that
it serves to
technically,
remove a little bit of this legal gray area. Now
right,
they're gainfully
right,
employed. They're not just kind of floating out there. What often goes overlooked, I think, in the experience of emancipation is, or even fleeing slavery, great, you're either emancipated or, no longer working in the fields, but where are you going to sleep at nights? How are you going to make money? So this goes a long way towards answering some of those questions for these
right,
people.
right. You, in essence, as you pointed out before, part of the struggle here is to get out of limbo. And once you're formally a part of the United States Navy, you're no longer in limbo. You are part of the United States Navy. You may be at the lowest rung, but you are still part of the United States Navy. And that is a big distinction.
Mhm.
So absolutely correct. And the other thing is, there is segregation permitted by the Department of the Navy, but it's sort of up to the commander. And all available evidence indicates that segregation wasn't very widely practiced among most of the Navy. And that's not just because of altruism, or may not be because of altruism at all, but it's very hard to, kind of stage segregation in a rigid way aboard a ship. It's a small confined area, it's kind of tough to do. And so by all accounts, the ship's crews, for the most part, were fairly well integrated, particularly in terms of certain key aspects of shipboard life. The most important at the time, up till 1862, until it was abolished, was the grog ration. That was kind of the big social occasion of every day aboard a U.S. ship. And those were not segregated. You would see African American sailors and white sailors lining up for the grog ration. So in many ways, there's some dramatic change occurring in the United States, or the Union Navy at that time. So we can go to the next slide. So all that being said, as I alluded to before, there is some concern about how white enlisted sailors will react. In many cases, they didn't react well. Now, initially, when white sailors encountered enslaved people, they were very sympathetic. They wanted to give them sanctuary. They wanted to protect them. But their attitudes changed dramatically when these African Americans start being incorporated into the Navy itself. And that's for a number of reasons. One, because of prejudice. That's undeniable. The other thing, though, is that it's because Navy sailors are very insecure about their station in life. They consider themselves to be among, at one of the lowest rungs of the social ladder, and the idea that these people who were at least below them will now rise to the same rank and maybe even surpass them is very disconcerting to them. And the other thing that starts to seep in is that they start to think that the officers give preferential treatment to the African American sailors. Now, there is some reason to believe that officers increasingly do start to hold African American sailors, in some cases, in higher esteem, because first of all, officers generally have a pretty low opinion of their crews. The crews aren't always happy campers, and there are a lot of disciplinary problems among, the existing crews that served aboard U.S. ship. Well, these new African American sailors, by and large, are very good workers, strong work ethic. They do a very good job, and they pose a lot less problems in terms of discipline. So anyway, there are all these kind of resentments brewing among the white sailors, and in many cases, this boils over to extreme harassment and mistreatment at their hands of African American sailors, and these things are called frictions. And sometimes these frictions can turn very violent and even result in the murder of African American sailors. And that leads the commanders of the US Navy to take very harsh measures against white sailors, and in some cases even hang them. So it's in some cases a very volatile atmosphere aboard these ships, at least initially for African American sailors. Now, there are also some differences in the attitudes of commanders, and these are generalities, but there is kind of a basic division between what's known as the blue water Navy and the brown water Navy. The blue water Navy is sort of the traditional Navy, ships that go out to sea, and those are the ships that are doing the blockade duty off the coast of the U.S. To try to enforce the naval blockade against the South. There are also elements of the U.S. Navy that go abroad and protect merchant shipping and that sort of thing. Those traditional U.S. Navy ships, the commanders on board those, by and large, don't have a problem with utilizing African American sailors. However, the situation's different among what's known as the brown water Navy. These are squadrons of ironclads, tinclads that roam the inland waterways of the United States, very often in areas that are still held by the Confederacy. And those commanders are very much concerned about including African Americans aboard their ships. And again, part of it is, prevailing prejudice and other things, but one of their big concerns is what's the reaction going to be of Southerners, even civilians, when they see these integrated crews. These ships are working within close proximity of these Southern communities, and they don't want to do anything that's going to bring about, sort of like guerrilla actions against their ships. So this is kind of a big question among them. And as you know, John, that is going to be kind of a big issue during the Civil War in the decision about whether to include African Americans into the American Armed Forces. What's the reaction going to be of the South?
And there are several infamous examples during some Civil War battles, infamously at the Battle of the Crater and at Fort Pillow, where Black soldiers and in some cases Black civilians are given no quarter.
Right.
So these fears in some cases are justified not only for the safety of the other members of the crew, but for the people serving as well.
Right. So on next slide, despite these prejudices and barriers, nonetheless, African Americans still continue to advance, and increasingly naval officers are very impressed with the performance of African American sailors, and they have very pressing needs for, again, more manpower for their ships, particularly in some areas that require skill and diligence. And so they start to include African Americans in more and more of these important positions. And these are things like as members of gun crews, carpenters, firemen, pilots, and even members of the night watch. That's one of the most important aspects of maintaining a ship. Even Admiral Porter, who we talked about before, had strong reservations about including African Americans aboard his ships, starts to include them in his gun crews. So by late 1862, you're coming into a situation where the crews of many Union ships consist of 25% to 50% African Americans. So on December 18th, 1862, Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles allows African Americans to enter the Navy as landsmen. That's the same rank that white sailors would enter into the service as. And they can ascend to the ranks of able seamen and eventually even petty officer ranks. And all of this is at the same pay as white sailors. Now, this is kind of a remarkable thing for a number of reasons. One, it's before the Emancipation Proclamation. So again, at this point, the Army doesn't even consistently allow African Americans into its service at all. And the other thing is, even after the Emancipation Proclamation, and even after the Army does start to allow African American units into its ranks, it's not paying them at the same, level as white soldiers, and that will not change until 1864. So again, this is another instance where, the Navy is remarkably progressive in what it's doing with African American sailors, given the times. So once African Americans do become, a mainstay of the Navy, they excel at their duties and they're renowned for their courage. And in fact, during the war, 7 African American sailors will earn the Medal of Honor. Their reputation is so good that when the Army's Adjutant General in 1863 is writing a report to determine whether the Army will allow African Americans to man Army artillery batteries, he will reference the Navy experience. He will say that the experience in the Navy is that the blacks handle heavy guns well. And indeed, getting back to our friend Admiral Porter, who again was resistant to having African Americans aboard his ship, he will eventually note that, quote, they do first rate. Now, the one area in which there are limits to what the Navy will do in terms of African Americans is they will not allow them to become commissioned officers. And unfortunately, that's not going to change until World War II. The Army, on the other hand, with the establishment of the United States Colored Troops, which is a segregated unit of the US Army, does commission a few officers for that unit. So this is the one instance in the Civil War where you could say that the Army was a bit more progressive. John, do you want to say anything about the US Colored Troops?
Just that the book that I would highly recommend, I think I have it on my bookshelf. Where'd it go? Yes, so there's a great book by Joseph Glatar called Forged in Battle, and it's all about that really complex dynamic between in the Army of the USCT, the black soldiers and the white officers. Complex, there's varying levels of prejudice and camaraderie that develops there. Not every unit's the same, it's all a little different. So there's a lot to say there. I'm hardly an expert, but that's what I would point people to as a great place to start with that. And I'll ask you too, the ensign here, William White Jr., is that the first or one of the first black officers in the Navy?
He's one of a group of officers that in 1942 the Department of the Navy, under great pressure, finally decides to initiate a program to start commissioning African American officers. The history of the Navy is kind of a roller coaster ride. There are these great aspects of their relationship with African American sailors that start before the Civil War. They'll continue through the Civil War, all the way until the the end of World War I, and then things dramatically go downhill. Basically, between 1919 and 1932, African Americans are not even allowed to enlist in the Navy.
Oh my goodness.
And even after 1932, they're only allowed to enlist to do kind of menial tasks, to serve as mess boys and stuff like that. It won't be until the start of World War II, when the Roosevelt administration comes under intense pressure from civil rights groups, that this idea of not only allowing African Americans to enlist in the Navy, but actually become commissioned, really comes to fruition.
Wow, that's incredible. I had no idea about that.
Yeah,
story.
it's kind of a very sad story in terms of things going backwards in the Navy for decades during the 20th century.
And I'll jump in here just to say a quick note. I mean, we're going a bit beyond the bounds of of Civil War medicine, but I think it's important to say that I think oftentimes when studying history and in particular studying the history of civil rights in the United States, there's all kinds of incredible progress that gets made during the Civil War era and even during the early part of the Reconstruction era. And then oftentimes people tend to just sort of jump ahead to the 1960s or, notable moments like during World War II, like we're talking about here. But, things were still happening basically, in the early part of the 20th century. And a lot of it is, not encouraging, but it's important, I think, for people to be kind of aware of things, like you were just saying, Brad, that happened during that interim period.
Right, and all this helps to explain where we came from and where we're at and how we got there. So, right.
Well, and that's what we do here at the museum. We try and connect the past to the present because they're a lot more related than I think it can sometimes appear.
Right, and speaking of the museum, I want to run this by you to make sure I got it right. But the other thing that does happen for the first time during the Civil War in the Union Army is that you do start to get the first African American surgeons, correct?
Yes, absolutely. We have a great book published by the museum. It's called Prologue to Change, and it highlights the 13, I believe is the number, African American surgeons who serve, most of them as U.S. Army surgeons, and a few of them that are civilians that get contracted. But yes, that is something that does happen for the first time during the Civil War.
Oh, great. So in talking about commissioned officers, I said officially none were commissioned in the Navy during the time of the Civil War, but there is one very, very notable exception. Robert Smalls is at the beginning of the war, an enslaved harbor worker, and he also serves as a ship's pilot in Charleston, South Carolina. Indeed, he does work for the Confederate Navy. He helps them with the Confederate ship, the Planter. And he devises a plan to help win freedom for his family and for some other enslaved people. And he puts into effect on May the 13th, 1862. The Confederate crew of the steamer Planter has rather carelessly left it unattended. So he decides he's going to steal the ship, and he does. And what he's going to do is he's going to sail it out of the harbor toward the U.S. or Union blockading fleet that lies just outside the harbor. It's a daunting task because he's not only going to have to navigate his way through the harbor, but he's going to have to know the passwords as he's challenged by Confederate batteries guarding the harbor. Well, he's a bright guy, and he knows the harbor like the back of his hand, and he also knows all those signals. So with that knowledge and with a lot of guts, he's able to take the planter, which is not only loaded with 17 enslaved people, but also 200 rounds of artillery ammunition and 6 artillery guns. He gets it through the harbor defenses, and he's able to rendezvous with the Union ship, the Onward, which is part of the blockading fleet. Now, once this happens, he's hailed as a hero throughout the Union. He's like a superstar, and he becomes a very powerful symbol of the contributions that African Americans can make if they're allowed to fight for the Union. Indeed, he has an audience with President Lincoln, and Lincoln is so impressed that he renews his commitment to quickly get more African Americans into the Union Army. Now, Smalls will go on to serve in a number of roles, both for the US Army and for the US Navy. Very often he's piloting ships that are used in campaigns by both the Army and the Navy. And eventually he's made captain of the Planter, the ship that he had secured for the Union. And although he's not formally commissioned as a captain per se, he does get accorded the same pay as a captain and the same retirement as a captain by act of Congress. After the war, he will serve as a US congressman from South Carolina, and he'll also serve as a number of very important capacities. So he's a remarkable individual. And no talk about the contribution of African Americans in the United States Navy would be complete without talking about the Navy's first nurses. And at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, we have an exhibit about a remarkable ship called the USN Red Rover. It's one of the world's first modern hospital ships, and it's developed by the Navy in 1863. And one of the great advances aboard that ship is the fact that it has the first professional female nursing staff aboard any US Navy vessel. It enlists 5 African Americans, as the title is, first class best boys, to serve as nurses. Now, one of the most famous of these nurses is Anne Bradford. She will later be known as Anne Bradford Stokes after she marries. She had escaped slavery and served aboard the Red Rover from January of 1863 to October of 1864. In 1890, she will apply to the U.S. Pension Board, citing her service aboard the Red Rover, and by virtue of that, she becomes the first American woman to receive a military pension for her service. And again, she's not the first African American woman to receive a pension. She's the first American woman to receive a pension for her service.
And I'll add too that my colleague Jake Wynn did a video about the USS Red Rover, also on our YouTube channel or Facebook page. So go check that out if you want to learn a bit more about that story, which is an incredible one.
So, in summarizing what we talked about today, I just like to point out a few things. One, that the legacy of African Americans in the U.S. Navy in terms of the whole issue of incorporating African Americans into wider American culture is profound. It's built on a rich history of African American naval service even before the Civil War. The U.S. Africa Squadron represents the first significant step, and I would say probably the one bright spot in antebellum America in trying to free enslaved people. The Union Navy offered early and unprecedented opportunities for African Americans who were escaping enslavement, and it gave them the ability to fight for their country and to make noticeable advancements in terms of their status. It's important to note that by the end of the Civil War, nearly 18,000 African American men and women served in the Union Navy, and that constitutes 20% of its enlisted force. So that's why I say they not only made a valuable contribution to the Union Navy, it's almost an indispensable contribution to the Union Navy. And the Navy is much smaller than the Army, granted, and many more African Americans served in the Army, that's for sure. But it is important to note that the proportion of African Americans serving in the Union Navy was nearly double that of the number of African American, or the proportion of African Americans serving in the US Army. So again, it really shows just how critical a role African Americans played in the Union Navy. And finally, as we've gone through this presentation, it should be obvious that African American sailors and African American nurses distinguished themselves through their perseverance, their dedication, their courage, and their heroic sacrifice. And I think the thing that sums it up best are the words of Robert Smalls. He writes, "My race needs no special defense, for the past history of them in this country proves them to be the equal of anyone. All they need is an equal chance in the battle of life." And I think the story of the United States Navy, or the Union Navy, is that in many ways, albeit imperfectly, it did provide those opportunities during the Civil War. This is a list of some of the sources I used for this presentation. You'll see close up to the top, second to the top, is the book that you referenced, Prologue to Change African Americans in Medicine in the Civil War, which is published by the National Museum of Civil War Medicine Press. There's some also other excellent books that are listed here, and I encourage you to give them a look. I also encourage you again to go see the USS Constellation to get a feel for what it was like to be a sailor aboard the US Africa Squadron or the Union Navy. Unfortunately, that museum is closed now because of the COVID pandemic, but when it reopens, it's a great place to go. And of course, I very, very highly recommend that you go to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick, Maryland. Of course, it's experiencing some of the same, difficulties because of the COVID pandemic. But as John mentioned so ably, and we'll probably mention again, check out the websites, become a member. It's a great resource.
And if you want to take note of any of these sources here, thanks to the beauty of video, you can pause this at any point and write those down. And here's Brad's contact information if you want to reach out to him. He's very friendly. And yes, as he mentions, the museum is at this time open for reservations. You can reserve a time. It'll be just you in the museum. We're open for that 7 days a week, but we do need 24 hours advance notice at least. So that is a way you can actually come and visit. And hopefully before too long, once it gets warmer and things start getting better, we can open with more regular hours. But that brings us to a close here. This was fantastic. I thoroughly enjoyed that presentation, and hopefully you did too out there. And if you did, one of the easy ways you all can help us, just like the video, share the video, like us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel. All of that helps us quite a bit. It's all free, it's all easy, that anyone can do. And as Brad says, if you want to take that next step, becoming a member of the museum helps us continue to bring videos and scholarship like this to you. So that would be fantastic. I know we'd really, really appreciate that if you can. Any final thoughts here, Brad?
I just want folks to know that we're available for weddings and bar mitzvahs. No, just kidding. No, I think that pretty well sums it up. You know, it's been great talking to you, John, and thanks for, you know, talking about certain key aspects of the things that we went over. And again, my main hope is that this sheds light on something that I think is very important in our nation's history.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. So with all that said, we'll see you next time. This is John and Brad signing off.